No one could remember seeing the gates of St. Catherine's Academy open. They stood rusted and polite at the end of a gravel drive, iron bars entwined with ivy so old it had hardened into something like bone. The school sat beyond them, deep in the woods, its brick facade perpetually dim, as though daylight lost interest before reaching it. Maps still marked the place, but no road signs did, and when asked, the locals spoke of it the way people speak of weather long past, vaguely, cautiously, and with the sense that it might return. The ledger was not supposed to exist anymore. According to the county clerk, all documents related to St. Catherine's Academy had been destroyed in a records purge sometime in the late 70s, a necessary clearing of space that erased dozens of defunct institutions with the same bureaucratic indifference. Yet the book surfaced in a mislabeled box at the back of a municipal storage facility, wedged between outdated zoning maps and tax rolls from towns that had since been absorbed into larger districts. Its spine was cracked, its cover warped by moisture, and its title, Admissions and Residency, was stamped so faintly it appeared more like a bruise than ink. At first glance, the ledger looked ordinary. Names, dates, places of origin. Girls admitted from neighboring counties, from farther towns, from nowhere identifiable at all. Many were listed as foundlings, wards of the state, or simply orphan. The handwriting changed every few pages, suggesting decades of clerks, matrons, and administrators had passed through St. Catherine's, each leaving behind a slightly different slant of letters, a different pressure of pen. The early entries followed a predictable rhythm: admission date, age, assigned dormitory, occasional notes about health or temperament. Some names were crossed out cleanly, followed by remarks indicating transfer, reunification with relatives, or discharge upon reaching maturity. Then the repetition began. 24 names appeared in the ledger and did not behave like the others. They were written once, neatly, as if given special care, and then never altered. Year after year, new administrators continued to list them as residents, always present, always unchanged. Ages were left blank after the initial entry, or marked with a small dash. Columns reserved for discharge dates remained empty. In the margins beside their names, there were faint impressions where ink had once pressed hard enough to leave scars in the paper, though whatever had been written there had been carefully erased. The journalist who discovered the ledger noticed the pattern only after photographing several pages and laying them out side by side. Individually, the entries were unremarkable. Together, they formed a quiet impossibility. Institutions closed. Children grew up. Even neglect followed a certain logic. But these girls persisted across pages separated by decades, surviving changes in ink, handwriting, and even formatting. One girl, admitted at age 7 in 1912, was still listed as a resident in the final entry dated 1989, without a single note to explain how or why. Seeking clarification, the journalist requested supplemental files, case histories, inspection reports, correspondence, anything that might explain the anomaly. Most requests came back empty. Some were denied outright. A few yielded fragments: a letter referencing long-term residents unsuitable for placement, a budget request for special provisions, an unsigned memo reminding staff that continuity is essential. None of it explained how 24 children could remain institutionalized for lifetimes without triggering intervention, inquiry, or at least paperwork substantial enough to survive. Interviews with retired county employees offered little comfort. Some remembered St. Catherine's vaguely, as a quiet place, well-funded despite its isolation. Others recalled it as a problem no one wanted to manage directly. One former inspector admitted he had never been allowed past the main administrative wing during his visits, always told that the girls were in class, at prayer, or resting. He remembered the building being warm even in winter, and the peculiar silence that followed him through its corridors, as if sound were being absorbed before it could echo. When shown copies of the ledger pages, reactions shifted. A few people grew defensive, insisting records were often inaccurate, that clerical errors compounded over time. Others simply stared too long at the names. One woman, whose mother had worked briefly at St. Catherine's as a cook, recognized a name instantly and asked for the page to be turned face down. She said her mother used to come home exhausted, complaining not about the work, but about how the girls watched her while she cooked, standing in perfect rows at the kitchen door, never speaking unless spoken to, never asking for food. The journalist compared the names against death certificates, census records, school registries, and hospital archives. None of the 24 appeared anywhere outside the ledger. It was as if they existed only within the Academy's accounting, sustained by ink and paper. Even in cases where surnames were common, dates and places never aligned. There were no graves. No obituaries. No foster records. No trace of adulthood. The most unsettling discovery came from a discrepancy in the ledger's pagination. Several pages had been removed cleanly, not torn, but cut with precision. The missing sections corresponded to years when oversight laws changed, when orphanages were reclassified, when new standards would have required detailed reporting on long-term wards. Someone had anticipated those moments and adjusted the record accordingly, preserving the appearance of order while eliminating scrutiny. In the final pages of the book, the handwriting was modern, the ink barely faded. The last clerk had drawn careful lines through every column, updating other residents, noting closures and transfers. Next to the 24 names, a single word appeared repeatedly in the remarks field, written so lightly it was almost invisible unless held at an angle: present. The fire was supposed to have ended everything. According to local newspapers, St. Catherine's Academy closed after a winter blaze gutted its upper floors, rendering the structure unsafe and forcing the remaining residents to be relocated. The article was brief, tucked between a church fundraiser and a highway update, and accompanied by a grainy photograph showing smoke curling from the roofline like a tired breath. There were no names listed, no follow-up stories, no mention of where the girls were sent. After that, St. Catherine's vanished from public conversation, folding neatly into the category of places that no longer mattered because they were assumed to be gone. Yet the absence was too clean. The journalist noticed it while cross-referencing closure dates against county maintenance records. Properties that burned or were condemned usually left behind a trail of paperwork, demolition permits, insurance claims, environmental assessments. St. Catherine's had none. The land remained owned by a charitable trust that no longer existed on paper, its tax status inexplicably renewed every few years without oversight. Utility records showed sporadic activity long after the reported fire, modest but consistent, as though someone had been careful not to draw attention by using too much electricity or water at once. Satellite images complicated the story further. Archived photographs from the decades following the fire showed the building unchanged. The roofline remained intact. The surrounding trees grew taller, but the academy itself did not sag or collapse the way abandoned structures typically did. Snow patterns were wrong. In winter images, drifts gathered everywhere except along the main entrance and the southern wing, where the ground appeared faintly warmer, bare of frost. Thermal scans, publicly available through environmental databases, registered intermittent heat signatures in that same area, irregular but persistent, like a heartbeat struggling to remain discreet. When questioned, locals repeated the same version of events with minor variations. The fire had been tragic but necessary. The building was unsafe. The girls were sent away. Pressed for details, their certainty frayed. No one remembered seeing buses. No one could name a receiving institution. Some claimed the fire had been electrical. Others said it started in the kitchen. A few insisted it never reached the dormitories at all. One man recalled watching flames from his porch as a boy, but admitted he couldn't remember if he had seen them with his own eyes or imagined them from stories told later. The journalist drove out to the academy one afternoon, stopping at the edge of the woods where the gravel road ended abruptly, swallowed by undergrowth. The gates were locked, but not chained. They resisted being pushed open, not from rust, but from something like intention, as though they had been set in place and told to remain so. Through the bars, the building looked untouched. Windows reflected the trees cleanly. There was no visible fire damage, no blackening of brick, no collapsed beams. The air smelled faintly of ash anyway, an old, dry scent that clung to the back of the throat. Official maps still showed the academy, but road signage did not. Delivery drivers reported GPS errors in the area, their routes looping or terminating early. Emergency services logs contained only one call related to the fire, marked resolved, with no supplemental documentation. When the journalist requested the original incident report, the fire department produced a photocopy missing key sections, including the list of occupants and the final inspection summary. The captain on duty at the time had retired and passed away years earlier. The most unsettling evidence came from an audit of state funding allocations. For nearly 2 decades after St. Catherine's was declared closed, small grants continued to be approved under outdated program codes. The amounts were too minor to attract attention, but consistent enough to suggest intentional maintenance rather than oversight. Someone had been submitting requests, someone had been justifying them, and someone else had been approving them without question, as though the system itself preferred not to notice what it was sustaining. Attempts to physically access the building were unsuccessful. Contractors refused the job, citing a sense that the structure was unsound despite visual evidence to the contrary. One surveyor quit halfway through his assessment, claiming the interior hallway seemed longer than the building's exterior dimensions allowed. Another reported hearing movement behind walls that, according to blueprints, should have been solid brick. None filed formal complaints. They simply declined to return. At night, nearby residents sometimes saw lights deep in the woods, steady and low, never flickering like flashlights or flaring like fires. They appeared in the same windows year after year, at the same hours, dimming in unison as if following a schedule. Those who noticed learned not to mention it. The academy had been closed, after all. Everyone knew that. It had burned. It was empty. It had ended. And yet the records continued, the utilities whispered of use, the satellites recorded warmth, and the building remained exactly as it had always been, waiting quietly for anyone who might still believe it was no longer there. The first recording was accidental. A graduate student conducting field research on nocturnal wildlife had placed several audio traps along the perimeter of the state forest bordering the old academy grounds, hoping to capture owl calls and fox movement for a thesis on habitat disruption. When he reviewed the files the next morning, most of the recordings were unremarkable: wind through branches, distant traffic, the occasional animal cry. One file, however, stood out not for what it contained, but for how abruptly the forest seemed to fall silent before something else took its place. The silence lasted nearly 12 seconds, a vacuum where even the insects appeared to pause. Then voices emerged, faint at first, layered so closely together they were difficult to separate. They were children's voices, high and breathless, speaking in careful unison. The cadence was rigid, almost mechanical, as if the words had been practiced too many times to allow for individuality. They were reciting something, not singing, not playing, but listing, each phrase delivered with identical timing and emphasis. The student assumed it was a prank. Perhaps hikers passing through, or someone playing a recording near the sensors. Yet the words themselves unsettled him. They followed a structure he recognized dimly from archival education manuals he had encountered in unrelated coursework, moral instruction drills phased out in the mid-20th century. Phrases about obedience, stillness, and gratitude repeated in a pattern that felt instructional rather than devotional. When he tried to match the text to any modern curriculum, nothing aligned. More recordings surfaced over the following weeks. Always between midnight and 3 in the morning. Always preceded by that same unnatural pause. Sometimes the voices counted numbers, ascending and descending without error. Other times they recited lists of rules, punishments, or virtues. Once, they named each other, 24 names spoken in sequence, the final voice lingering a fraction of a second longer, as if waiting for a response that never came. When the journalist obtained copies of the files, the audio quality was poor, but the consistency was unmistakable. Background noise suggested the voices were moving, not stationary, circling the sensors at varying distances. Yet there were no footsteps, no snapped twigs, no indication of physical bodies displacing the forest floor. Audio analysts confirmed the recordings were unaltered, free of digital manipulation, and captured from multiple locations simultaneously, ruling out a single source. Attempts to replicate the phenomenon under controlled conditions failed. When researchers set up additional equipment closer to the academy, the devices malfunctioned, batteries draining inexplicably or files corrupting beyond recovery. Motion sensors triggered without visible cause. Thermal cameras detected fleeting shapes that vanished before they could be resolved. The forest itself seemed resistant to observation, offering just enough evidence to suggest something was there while refusing to allow confirmation. The content of the recordings grew more disturbing over time. The voices began to incorporate phrases that had never appeared in any documentation the journalist could find. References to rooms without doors. To lessons that continued after sleep. To a bell that rang only once, and what happened to those who did not stand quickly enough. The tone remained flat, emotionless, but the material carried a quiet cruelty, delivered with the same discipline as a multiplication table. One recording captured what sounded like correction. A single voice broke from the rhythm, stumbling over a word. The others stopped immediately. For several seconds, only breathing could be heard, shallow and rapid. Then an older-sounding voice spoke, lower, calmer, issuing instructions too softly to fully discern. When the recitation resumed, the errant voice was gone. Linguists noted that the accents were inconsistent with the region, as if the voices had been preserved from different eras, flattened into a single register. Some pronunciations reflected speech patterns no longer in use. Others bore the marks of early childhood training, carefully shaped consonants enforced through repetition. None sounded older than 12. As word spread quietly among researchers, a few locals came forward with stories they had never shared publicly. Campers recalled hearing whispers just beyond their firelight, stopping the moment they turned their heads. A night ranger described radios crackling with children's voices reciting procedures that had nothing to do with park operations. A woman who lived near the woods said her daughter once woke screaming, insisting her bedroom had filled with girls standing shoulder to shoulder, asking her to repeat the rules with them. The journalist compared the recitations to materials recovered from St. Catherine's administrative wing. Fragments of lesson plans, disciplinary codes, and daily schedules matched the recordings almost word for word. Some phrases appeared only in handwritten margins, never formalized, yet were spoken clearly in the forest at night. It was as though the building itself had learned the lessons by heart and was now repeating them through the trees. The most troubling file was recorded during a heavy snowfall, when sound should have been muffled. The voices carried anyway, crisp and close. Near the end, after the final recitation ended, a new sound emerged, a bell, distant but unmistakable, ringing once. Immediately, all 24 voices inhaled sharply at the same time, and the recording cut out abruptly, not from technical failure, but because there was suddenly nothing left to record. The first indication that St. Catherine's had been designed for permanence came from a mismatch between its blueprints and its physical footprint. The original architectural plans, recovered from a diocesan archive, showed a modest academy with 2 dormitory wings, a chapel, classrooms, and service corridors laid out in a rational grid. But when those plans were overlaid onto satellite imagery and survey data, entire sections failed to align. Interior hallways appeared to extend farther than the building's exterior dimensions allowed, and rooms listed as storage or utility spaces seemed to recur in places they should not have existed at all. A structural engineer who reviewed the discrepancies suggested initially that renovations or undocumented expansions might explain the inconsistencies. That explanation fell apart when ground-penetrating radar revealed hollow spaces stacked within walls, between floors, and beneath staircases that did not appear on any plan. These cavities were not random. They followed patterns, repeating at regular intervals, each roughly the size of a small bedroom, each connected by narrow passages just wide enough for a child to move through sideways. There were no signs of later construction. The materials matched the original build, as if these spaces had been there from the beginning, concealed deliberately rather than added over time. Inside, the logic of the building shifted further. Former staff who had been inside the academy decades earlier described a sensation of corridors subtly redirecting them, of doors that led somewhere different on the return trip. Measurements taken during brief, sanctioned inspections never matched twice. A hallway paced at 20 steps one day required 24 the next, without any visible alteration. Light fixtures appeared in places not marked on electrical plans, drawing power from sources no one could trace. It was as if the academy responded to occupancy, adjusting itself to accommodate those inside. The most chilling discovery was the repetition of certain architectural features. Small alcoves lined many of the hidden corridors, each containing a built-in bed frame, a shelf, and a narrow desk carved directly into the wall. The craftsmanship was precise but austere, identical from space to space, erasing any sense of individuality. Scratches marked the wood at uniform heights. Fingertips had worn the same edges smooth. On some desks, names had been etched carefully, then scratched out and replaced, the surface bearing layers of ownership without ever allowing permanence. These were not cells. There were no locks, no bars, no obvious restraints. The confinement was subtler, enforced through design rather than force. Passageways looped back on themselves. Staircases descended into familiar landings regardless of how many flights were taken. Doors opened easily but closed behind with a soft finality, blending seamlessly back into the wall. Those who explored deeper reported a growing sense of disorientation paired with an overwhelming urge to remain still, to wait for instruction, to follow the path that felt most familiar even when it led nowhere new. Records hinted that the girls were moved through these spaces as part of a system rather than punished within them. Marginal notes in staff manuals reference reassignment, realignment, and reinforcement. A girl who struggled with lessons might be relocated closer to the chapel. One who disobeyed could be moved inward, away from windows and exits, where the building's geometry tightened. Compliance was rewarded not with freedom, but with stability. The more perfectly a girl followed the rules, the more seamlessly she fit into the academy's interior, until her presence no longer disrupted its balance. Over time, names seemed to lose their meaning. The ledger showed alterations that were not corrections but substitutions, one name overwritten with another, then another still. In some cases, two girls appeared to merge into a single entry, their individual remarks condensed into a shared notation. It was as if identity itself had become fluid within the academy, something that could be adjusted to suit the institution's needs. The building did not merely house the girls, it categorized, redistributed, and preserved them. Witness accounts supported the idea that leaving was not explicitly forbidden, just rendered impractical. Doors that should have led outside opened into interior courtyards surrounded by more walls. Windows revealed views of trees that did not correspond to any external angle. Attempts to force exits resulted not in resistance, but in redirection, the space gently guiding movement away from thresholds and back toward the center. The academy did not trap its occupants in the traditional sense. It absorbed them, integrating their routines, their voices, their schedules into its own structure. The longer the girls remained, the less distinction there was between inhabitant and architecture. Audio recordings suggested that the voices heard in the woods followed the same paths night after night, tracing corridors that no longer existed in any rational sense. Thermal imaging showed residual heat in shapes that matched the hidden rooms rather than the visible ones. Even after decades, the building behaved as though it were still fully occupied, lights dimming and brightening on a schedule that matched no external clock. St. Catherine's had not been designed to let anyone leave because departure was never part of its function. The academy operated as a closed system, one that took in children without attachments, stripped away the markers of individual life, and reassigned them into a living pattern of obedience and repetition. What remained of the girls was not memory or record, but placement. They were not lost within the building. They had become part of its internal order, their presence redistributed through walls and corridors that continued to adjust, preserve, and make room, waiting patiently for the next small figure to step inside and find that the space already knew exactly where she belonged. The realization did not arrive as a single revelation but as a convergence of quiet confirmations, each one small enough to dismiss until together they formed an undeniable shape. St. Catherine's Academy was never an orphanage in the traditional sense. It did not exist to rehabilitate, educate, or release. Every record, every architectural anomaly, every preserved voice suggested a different purpose entirely. The academy functioned less like an institution and more like a mechanism, one that required a specific type of occupant to continue operating as intended. The girls were not prisoners. That implication mattered, because it explained the absence of overt violence in the records. There were no mass graves, no documented punishment severe enough to justify disappearance, no frantic letters begging for rescue. What existed instead was consistency. Schedule. Continuity. The academy offered certainty to children who had arrived without it, children unclaimed, unnoticed, already erased from the edges of society. In return, it asked for compliance, for repetition, for surrender of anything that made departure conceivable. The ledger's final pages hinted at this most clearly. After the Academy's supposed closure, the entries did not stop. They changed. Admissions no longer listed ages or origins. Names appeared briefly, then were overwritten, replaced by designations that resembled functions rather than identities. One entry contained only a single letter. Another was marked with a symbol repeated elsewhere in the margins, its meaning unclear but its placement deliberate. The category of resident remained constant, but what qualified as a resident had shifted. Audio recordings from the woods began to include unfamiliar voices, slightly older, slightly different in tone. They did not disrupt the established rhythm, only expanded it. Where there had once been 24 voices, there were now moments where a 25th almost emerged, hesitating at the edge of the chorus before blending in. The recitations adapted, incorporating new phrases, new rules, as if the system were updating itself to accommodate additional material. Missing persons databases revealed patterns that were easy to overlook individually. Girls reported lost near foster homes, shelters, group facilities, often within a 100-mile radius of the Academy. Cases that stalled quickly. Children without photographs. Children described as quiet, compliant, difficult to place. The timeline of these disappearances aligned disturbingly well with spikes in utility usage at the Academy, with subtle changes in the building's thermal footprint, with adjustments in the cadence of the voices heard at night. Witnesses described encounters that no longer fit the narrative of a dormant ruin. Hikers spoke of seeing a light on in an upper window where no wiring should have remained intact. A delivery driver recounted being flagged down by a girl in an outdated uniform, standing just inside the tree line, who vanished when he slowed his vehicle. A social worker claimed that a child once asked her, very politely, if she knew the way to St. Catherine's, as if it were still accepting applications. The Academy's genius lay in its restraint. It did not hunt. It did not lure openly. It simply remained available, a solution to a problem no one wanted to solve. Systems designed to manage unwanted children were already strained, already accustomed to loss through neglect rather than malice. When a girl slipped through, there were always explanations ready. Paperwork errors. Runaways. Administrative gaps. St. Catherine's required only that the world continue to look away. Inside, the process repeated as it always had. New arrivals were taught the rules. They learned the schedules, the lessons, the proper way to stand and speak and listen. Individuality was not punished, merely ignored, starved until it withered from disuse. Those who adapted found the Academy comforting in its predictability. Those who resisted were not broken, only repositioned, guided into spaces where resistance lost its relevance. Over time, the distinction between old and new residents dissolved. The voices blended. The architecture adjusted. The system did not preserve the girls as they were, but as they functioned. What remained of them was not consciousness in any recognizable sense, but pattern. They became part of the Academy's memory, its operational logic, its way of sustaining itself without decay. The journalist understood then why the Academy had never truly closed, why the fire had been allowed to exist only as a story. Destruction would have drawn attention. Absence would have invited investigation. Continuity was safer. The building did not need caretakers or administrators anymore. It had internalized its purpose. All it required was an occasional new presence to keep the pattern intact. St. Catherine's Academy was not waiting for rescue or discovery. It was waiting for intake. Somewhere, a girl was being overlooked, misfiled, quietly set aside by a system that had already decided she did not quite belong. When she stepped close enough to the woods, the Academy would make room, adjusting corridors and schedules with practiced ease, ready to teach her the rules that would ensure she never needed to leave.